In today's webinar, A Year in Internet Analysis 2023, we are joined by Doug Madory, Director of Internet Analysis at Kentik, and we will reflect on a wide range of events that took place over the past year, including Border Gateway Protocol leaks or BGP leaks, major outages, submarine cable cuts, and a historic submarine cable activation. This past year, we heard about major internet outages and their impacts. This was, for instance, the case for Microsoft Azure earlier in the year, when their outage impacted parts of its services in North America and Asia. And just last month, the Australian operator Optus suffered another outage that left millions without telephone or internet access. Other events from 2023 that we will be discussing include recent BGP leaks, with an eye towards how much RPKI route origin validation, or ROV, is helping to limit disruption. The activation of the submarine cable in Helena is another one that we will hear more about, and how the ongoing war in Ukraine continues to shape the country's internet. During our webinar today, Doug will use insights from such events to discuss what impact they could have in the future. He will talk us through the technical underpinnings of the global internet systems and the effects of outages and other global events on connectivity. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to Doug Madory, Director of Internet Analysis at Kentik. Over to you, Doug.
All right, so my name is Doug Madory. I'm the Director of Internet Analysis at Kentik, and this is a review of some of the analysis I did over the past year, which I hope you find insightful. So a little about Kentik. Kentik is probably most widely known as a NetFlow analysis company, but we do a lot of other things besides that. We're a company of about 200 people. We have hundreds of customers. In fact, some of the logos are on the bottom of the slide. There's a lot of famous companies rely on Kentik to do their network monitoring, specifically NetFlow, as well as other types of telemetry, including BGP monitoring, performance monitoring, and as well as cloud analysis of their cloud deployments. So I take it as a lead analyst for Kentik. I get to use a lot of this data to understand what's going on in the global internet, and a lot of that goes into the presentation that I'm going to give today. So here are the three main areas, and this is typically in the stuff that I've been doing for almost 15 years now of internet analysis. These are the common buckets that my analysis falls into. 2023 was no exception to that. So the first thing we'll talk about are some updates around BGP routing, especially RPKI and a couple of leaks. And then we'll talk about some outage analysis that I did this year. And then finally, submarine cable activations cuts and geopolitics, the last category there. So why don't we get started on the first one? So earlier this year, I published a blog post. You can find it online, or you can download the slides, get the link out of that there. A brief history of the internet's biggest BGP incidents. And so the background of where this blog post came to be was last year in the US, the FCC, our federal agency overseeing communications, put out a request for input on how and what they ought to be doing to improve the state of routing security. And so I got enlisted to join this industry group, BTAG, which is an organization that represents the broadband internet providers of the United States. And BTAG assembled a kind of a who's who of all the experts in this space to write up a report with just detailing the state of affairs and routing security, as well as recommendations. My main contribution to that was together with a researcher from Princeton. We wrote if you were new to the topic, what would be the big incidents to be aware of that shape our understanding of the weaknesses in BGP? So I wrote that up for that report last year. I decided this year I would publish it on its own, and it's gotten a lot of traction. It was republished by Nanog, by AppNec, and then LACNIC most recently published a translation in Spanish for Spanish speakers. And But the and so the story of BGP begins way back in the year of our Lord Taylor Swift, 1989, where it this is a protocol that was either 2 napkins or 3 napkins. It sounds like it's an inauspicious start where we still are debating how many napkins were involved in the creation of this protocol that underpins internet routing. I think the answer to that question is that there's 3 sides to 2 napkins, perhaps. But if you learn anything from the presentations I give on BGP and the issues that are still out there with BGP, it's we're going to need more napkins to cover the rest of the stuff, and that's where things like RPKI come in. So recently, I've been looking at just the measuring the progress in the deployment of RPKI ROV. So this is specifically the ROV functionality, route origin validation, which is checking the origins of routes and as they're in their AS path, and rejecting those that are that don't match the origin listed in the route origin authorization, the ROA, as well as the max prefix length. So there's been a lot of progress. I hope you're maybe already aware of this in this space. And we now have all but about 2 of the backbone carriers now reject RPKI invalid routes. It's a big deal. And then that's on the rejection of invalids. And on the flip side is the creation of ROAs, because you need those 2 pieces for the whole system to work. That too has been moving in the right direction. This is a graph from last year, and we're only a couple months away now. If you were to go look at this and see these lines cross. So this graph is produced by NIST, which is another U.S. federal agency. We have many of them. And this one is tracking. They have a group within NIST that studies routing security, and that group publishes has a web page that publishes a lot of stats. And this one is looking at all of the BGP routes in the global routing table and how many are valid based on an existing ROA versus how many have no ROA, which is the yellow line, the unknowns going down. And then there's also persistently invalid routes. And so there's a red line. It's very hard to see because it just hugs the x-axis of things that are just always invalid due to one misconfiguration or another. It represents a very, very small amount of the total number. But these lines are going in the right direction. And like I said, in a couple months, we expect to see these lines cross, and we'll have the majority of BGP routes will be valid based on existing ROAs. So that means there's more ROAs being created. This is a graph for IPv4, but if you were to look at v6, it looks essentially the same. Let's see, move on. So the one analysis I did last year that I republished again this year, I just brought the numbers up to date based on some more recent statistics, was to look at the time we were about when I started working on this, around 1/3 of BGP routes were valid based on their ROAs. Basically, they have ROAs, and so I work at a company that has a lot of NetFlow data. So NetFlow are records of internet transmissions, and so we have we don't have it all. Nobody has it all, but we have a good slice of just traffic, records of traffic going through the internet. And so I could look at in various metrics. I used bits per second. How much traffic is heading towards routes with valid ROAs? And it turned out that the majority of it was, even though that we were only at 1/3 of BGP routes that had ROAs, so we were actually, the RPKI ROV mechanism was more of the internet, majority of the traffic was eligible for the protection that RPKI would provide. And so the reason being was that, like in the United States, we have the major broadband carriers, Comcast and Spectrum had big RPKI deployments. They have signed ROAs for all their routes. They're dropping invalids. And on the flip side, you have major content providers, whether that's Cloudflare, Akamai, Google, Amazon, all those companies have also had RPKI deployments. And when you have the major eyeball networks and the major content providers all doing RPKI, then that accounts for a much larger amount of traffic than just the counts of BGP routes would lead you to believe. So we're actually we've made more progress than people realized, was the point. And then on the flip side, like ROAs alone are useless if nobody is rejecting invalids. And so there's been a few different approaches to try to measure how many networks out there are rejecting RPKI invalid routes. Again, if nobody's rejecting the invalid routes, then the whole thing doesn't work, and it doesn't matter how many ROAs you have. And so this is a tricky thing to measure directly to get a percentage of how many ASs are actually rejecting invalids. There's been a few different attempts at trying to do this. The number is probably a small percentage, but that percentage, just like the routes a minute ago, kind of belie. There's different ASs have different levels of importance to the internet. And so what I thought I'd do is look at routes that are how far does a route propagate when it's either valid or doesn't have a ROA versus when they're invalid. I mentioned those persistently invalid routes that are in existence at any given time due to misconfigurations. Well, we can use that to measure what was the difference between valid or on these graphs we see RPKI not found. Those are routes without a ROA. The orange ones are valid. And so it's very hard to see, but the x-axis is how many BGP sources, this is using route views data, how many BGPs of their BGP sources saw how many routes. That's the y-axis. So what you end up with is between the RPKI not found, routes without ROAs, and invalid, you have these spike around what are globally routed routes. And then there's the very small dusting of things that come short of that. And then in green are routes that are invalid, and so those are getting filtered. And you can see that how far an invalid route propagates, it at best is going to see one half of the propagation, and at worst, something very, very small. And this is evidence of the system working, where we're limiting the propagation of invalid routes, and that will limit the disruption that a routing leak will have in the future. All right, so then there's been a handful of routing leaks. There was just another couple in the last couple of weeks. Haven't read anything up on those. There are quite a few still happening. So these are mistaken incidents where an AS is announcing routes in a way that it shouldn't. And so in this case, I wrote up a blog post of a tale of two BGP leaks. There was two in quick succession in different parts of the world. That I thought I'd dig into. There are different types of leaks. So this first one is by a Bangladeshi ISP that took all of its routes that it was learning from its peers and mistakenly announced it through BTCL, the incumbent of Bangladesh, and out to the internet. And so this lasted, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And because it didn't change in this type of leak, the origin is not affected. So the AS, the rightmost AS in the AS path is not changed. And so things like RPKI, ROV, any kind of origin-based filtering is not going to do anything because the origin is intact. And so that's where you need this ASPA, Autonomous System Provider Authorization system, to be deployed. ASPA is still in its early stages, but once it's fielded, this will be a system where ASs can register what are their transit relationships that will enable other networks to see that that there's a valley-free violation is what we call it. There's an invalid AS path and be able to reject a route based on the information provided in ASPA. In this particular, this graphic, we see a route from Microsoft going to the Bangladesh provider, who then sends it to BTCL. Well, that Bangladeshi provider to BTCL will be a transit relationship. The Microsoft to the Bangladeshi ISP would be a peering relationship. So you can't have a peering edge and then a transit edge. That would be considered a valley, and it would be rejected in ASPA once that gets fielded. But for the time being, we have no protection other than just filtering what routes should be expected to be seen from downstream ASs. Let's see. So the other example that happened again within a day or two of the first one was there was a V6 origination leak from Brazil, and so an AS in Brazil originated just about the whole IPv6 routing table, and And because it's an origination leak, they're mistakenly announcing it as if they are the origin or they are the destination for all the traffic. This is something where RPKI ROV can make a difference, and we can measure, or estimate how much good it did. And so that's what I was trying to do in these graphs that were again up here on the blog post. Both graphs are the same data. The one on the right, it just has the y-axis in log form, just to accentuate the difference between the two plots. What I'm doing is looking at all of the routes that were announced by the leaker, and how many of them were either unknown because the normal route had no ROA, or they were invalid because there was a ROA and it's invalid. And then the y-axis is the propagation. So again, measuring how many of the route views BGP sources saw the leaked routes based on whether it was lacked a ROA or had a ROA. And you can see the orange line is those that have had ROAs, were invalid, and then that reduced the propagation. The difference between the two lines is the reduction of propagation that RPKI ROV introduces. And so this is more evidence of trying to limit the propagation and therefore limit the disruption that these leaks can cause. So if you come away with nothing, I hope that these two facts are something you remember and become common knowledge in networking today, and that the majority of internet traffic these days is directed to RPKI valid routes. So this ought to be motivation to reject invalid routes, because that is going to protect the traffic that you are egressing. It won't get misdirected based on a leak. You will be rejecting those routes. You will send it to its destination. And then number two, that route propagation is cut in half when evaluated as RPKI invalid. And that ought to be motivation to create ROAs for your address space, because the internet now is going to be looking out on your behalf. So that if some other entity, a leak or a hack, an attacker, tries to announce your address space with their own AS, the internet will suppress those routes and limit how far they propagate and limit how much disruption they cause. So let's skip ahead to outage analysis here. So I did a couple this year. The background here is our Wikipedia page for the Facebook outage. So Azure, Microsoft's major cloud, public cloud, suffered an outage on January 25th, and we looked at it from a variety of different of our data types. One of those is our cloud-to-cloud monitoring, region-to-region performance monitoring, and so we operate a very large mesh of measurements going between every region of every cloud to every other region of every other cloud. So it's more than 10,000 continuous measurements going on there. And this is and so then when there's an outage like this, we can pull this up very quickly and figure out what are the parts that are affected. A user of the system can do this as well. In the end, Microsoft published an explanation blaming a flawed router command that took down parts of their network. It sounded a little like Facebook, the Facebook outage in October 2021, which also was caused by a flawed router command, among other things. In this graphic we're looking at of measurements from Azure's region in Seattle, Washington to Singapore, a lot of these disruptions occurred in Asia. And so in this, we're looking at latency dropping to zero once the measurements are no longer reaching their destination. Packet loss goes to 100%, so it's offline during this period of time between 7:20 and 8:40 UTC, so over an hour. And like I said, it varied greatly depending on where you were crossing. And then these are going just internal to. We're not going out on the internet when we're measuring from one region to another region within a cloud. So this is a problem within their network as well. And another interesting fact here when I was going through the data was looking at this traffic surge here. So we went and pulled from our Asian customers how much traffic they're seeing to Microsoft 8075. And we saw a big surge in traffic. You have to think about why that would be. Why would we see a surge of traffic during an outage? And it has to do with the fact that Azure lost a lot of its peering relationships during the outage. And so traffic was then, instead of going directly over these private peering connections to Microsoft, we're then having to get put onto transit networks to go across the internet that way, and that put it into the path of put it on networks that are customers of Kentik, and so the volume of traffic probably didn't change. In fact, it probably went down during this outage, but the volume of traffic that we could see, because it was going across our customer base, increased as those peering links went down and people had to rely on transit to move all this Microsoft traffic. Let's see. So as I mentioned, they published a post-incident review, mentioned that it was they tried to change the IP address on a WAN router. It didn't work out. So like I said, it looked a little like the Facebook outage of 2021, another analysis that we did quite a bit of. And then it triggered some sort of an internal update storm according to their explanation. And that sounds a little like the routers outage, which was work. And we could observe some instability in BGP, but this was a symptom and not the cause of the outage. This is something I've been trying to emphasize in some of these analyses as of late in the last couple of years. Is a lot of times we look at the impacts in BGP, and a lot of times there are impacts in BGP, but like routes are getting withdrawn, but that is not the cause of the outage. It is a symptom of an internal, a larger internal problem. All right, and so moving on to the Optus outage. So this just happened about a little more than a month ago. This was a very, very large mobile, outage, impactful outage in Australia. And so Optus is one of the big telecoms in Australia. Has millions of Australians as customers. It is a subsidiary of Singtel, which is the telecom out of Singapore. And they suffered a catastrophic outage beginning at 1704 UTC on November 7th, which is in local time in Sydney. It was about 4 a.m. On the 8th of November. And so this is our visualization of traffic based on, again, our NetFlow data by region of, and if you're not familiar with Australian geography, I'll explain it in a second here. So everything goes down, obviously, at 1704. And then it starts to come back in the eastern regions, so like where Sydney and Melbourne are. Most people live in the east part of the country, and then places like Perth on the west coast come back hours later. But let's talk about this outage. So I'll mention this, that there was a lot of speculation going on. This caught a lot of attention, especially obviously in Australia. And there was some question about, did RPKI have a role in this outage? It did not. But there was something that I thought was worth mentioning when I did my write-up on this, was looking at. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation in the BGP section that there are a persistent number of persistently invalid routes at any given time, and that it was a red line that was hugging the x-axis in the NIST graph. Well, Optus does their part there, where they announce a number of persistently invalid routes due to a misconfiguration in the ROA. So this is a common misconfiguration where they have set the max prefix length of the ROA to be, I think it's in this case maybe 19. So the prefix length cannot be anything longer than /19. Well, they also announce the two, like in this example, 2/20s. So those are invalid, and they are getting filtered as those routes try to propagate to the internet. Not sure what they're trying to do here. If those are probably maybe not supposed to be announced to the global internet, but they're invalid and they get filtered. So in this case, what was interesting was that there's a number of cases that look a little like this graphic here. Maybe it's hard to follow, but let me try to explain it. So there are a couple of things going. Obviously, there's the ball and stick diagram of the ASs at the bottom. And so you have 3 prefixes announced by Optus to its transit providers. That's essentially what the ball and stick diagram is trying to show at the bottom, with the prefixes all the way on the right, propagating to the left. And then at the top, there is a line graph. And what it's showing is that /19, which is a covering prefix for the 2/20s, normally is seen by, I think, 98%, 99% of our BGP sources. You never really ever attain 100% on these things. So that's essentially globally routed. It had 2/20s, which are cover the same amount of address space, but those are invalid due to a misconfigured ROA. And once the /19 gets withdrawn during the outage, then the internet has to, if it wants to reach that address space, has to use those /20s, which are invalid. And so for most of the internet, that address space became unreachable. And so because of this, you might think that reachability was the problem of the outage. However, it was not. There were plenty of counterexamples where the address space did not, the routes did not drop due to the outage, and however, they stopped carrying traffic nonetheless. So that makes me conclude that things like this, this BGP phenomenon, are more of a symptom versus a cause of the outage. So what was the end result here? So again, I mentioned this is a big deal in Australia. The CEO was called by the end of the week to testify in front of the Australian Senate. This is her here. They had a preliminary investigation that revealed that there was an internal routing leak from a sibling network. So another subsidiary of Singtel had leaked, accidentally announced a bunch of routes into Optus, which is a mistake. These things happen. The reaction of the Optus network, though, was not good, to put it lightly. And so what it ended up doing was that all of the Optus routers, they used Cisco routers, and they used the default setting for max pref. So max pref is the maximum number of prefixes that a network should see across a session. And so typically this gets set at, if you normally see 100, maybe you set it at 2, 3, 500. You give it some headroom for growth because you don't want to have to constantly revisit this setting. But basically, if it suddenly sees 10,000 prefixes across a session that it normally would only see 100, that's too much. It's evidence of a leak, and so the router kills the session to protect itself and protect the rest of the network. Unfortunately, the default configuration for Cisco routers is that that max pref activates, it kills a session, and requires manual intervention to restart it. The preferred setting, the best practice, is to give it a retry period of a couple of minutes, because it's a pretty good chance that after a couple of minutes, the leak is over, the router brings the session back up, and all is good. Because of that default setting, the forever setting on the max prefix on the Cisco routers, it required manual restart. Again, it's easy for us to look at this knowing what the problem was now after the fact, but you can imagine during the outage, they had no out-of-band network, they had no communications, they had no telemetry or monitoring, and everything's down. So it took a while to piece this story together, and eventually they got the service back up. But it did cost the CEO her job, and she resigned the following week following the testimony before the Australian Senate. All right, so the last section here is about submarine cables and geopolitics. So submarine cables is an area of interest of mine. It is an area of fascination for a lot of people, me included, and as well as the geopolitical stuff. This is stuff that typically is accessible to a much wider audience. I hope you find this interesting. So at the beginning of the year, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Alba 1 activation to Cuba. So just as a background to this, the country of Cuba had been completely reliant on geostationary satellite service up until 10 years ago. and that was a result of the U.S. embargo against Cuba. They were left out of every submarine cable project in the Caribbean, and had to use geostationary satellite, which has high latency, low bandwidth, low capacity, and then generally higher costs per megabit. I had spotted the activation 10 years ago, got the Cuban government to confirm it. It was a big story for us way back then, and the internet in Cuba has grown slowly in the intervening decade. There was a recent attempt to connect a second cable to Cuba. This is the Aros Cable. This is a pan-Caribbean network that touches quite a few countries. They had submitted a request to the U.S. To the FCC for permission to build a spur to connect to Cuba. Because this cable lands in the United States, then the U.S. Government gets to reject such a review and reject such a request. The Department of Justice's Team Telecom, which reviews national security issues, published their final decision about a month prior to, or their recommendation, which is essentially a decision the FCC is not going to. They're going to follow this recommendation from the Department of Justice. 1 month prior to the 10-year anniversary, and said that they denied this request, said that it would create, quote, mitigable risks to the national security and law enforcement interests in the United States. So I wrote up a blog post there with expressing skepticism around this rationale. One of the things that they wrote, this is a quote in the from the report, was that if the cable were built, then Atexa, which is a state telecom of Cuba, would be able to take advantage of the weaknesses of BGP to cause BGP route leaks, rerouting traffic through Cuba, and put it into over segment 26, which was the spur that they were trying to build, put it into the government's hands for traffic interception. The truth is, this could happen today, and nothing stops them from doing this today. In fact, each of the risks, the mitigable risks that they list or enumerate, is true today with or without this the connection to the Aros cable. In my humble opinion, I would think it would be better for the internet in Cuba, for the people of Cuba, as well as our purported support for an open and free internet communications in Cuba, to have a second cable connection. But that was not going to happen, at least not with the Aros cable. In the end, Orange Telecom from France has built another point-to-point line over to Martinique, so that it looks like they will have a second submarine cable. But that was an analysis I did at the beginning of the year, and then most recently we saw the activation of the St. Helena submarine cable, which maybe if you saw the movie Napoleon recently, you may know, maybe familiar with St. Helena. It's most famous for being the final island of exile for Napoleon Bonaparte. But this is a British overseas territory, presently with a population of 5,200 people. It's a very small, rocky island in the South Atlantic. And up until just recently, just like Cuba was 10 years ago, was completely reliant on geostationary satellite service. Again, high cost, high latency, low bandwidth. It was a big project to get this cable, this island, connected via submarine cable, so that they could have high-speed internet and improve their economy. And in this blog post, I'm close with the individual who launched a 12-year lobbying effort. I told his story of founding an NGO to do advocacy work to try to get St. Helena connected to a cable. Ultimately, it was the Google's Equiano cable that was built recently down the west coast of Africa, that built a spur to the island, or they connected a spur, I should say, because it was they were willing to connect it if St. Helena could come up with the funds to build the cable, and they actually applied and received a grant from the EU to build about $20 million to build the spur cable landing station in St. Helena, and a spur that initially just dropped out into the ocean. When Equiano came down, they picked it up off the seafloor and connected it. kind of fascinating stuff. But what's wild is, again, this is a British overseas territory, and that was in 2018 that they got the grant from the EU 2 years after the Brexit vote. And this is probably one of the last things that the EU, grants of money that the EU gave to St. Helena. St. Helena had to either get the support from the UK or the EU because it is a British overseas territory. It was ineligible for any kind of support from the African Development Bank or other types of regional entities that might have put up the money. But nonetheless, October 1st, we saw the first traffic pass over the cable. I published a blog post. Here's how it looked in some of our data. So we saw the graphic on the left is latencies coming from AWS in London to Sure South Atlantic is the one monopoly ISP in St. Helena, starting at a latency of 657 milliseconds, which is pretty normal for a geostationary satellite. A geostationary satellite cannot be anything lower than 480 milliseconds just due to the speed of light. This is a round trip time. And you can see there's a little dip there right after midnight, and then an hour later it drops and goes down to 131 milliseconds from London. Now we're going entirely over the submarine cable. On the right is essentially the same timeline, but looking at it from a BGP standpoint. You have the ball and stick diagram of the AS diagram at the bottom, and then on the top we're looking at a stack diagram of how does the internet through what AS does the internet, all the BGP sources we have, get to Sure South Atlantic. Initially, it's this light green. That's Intelsat, the geostationary satellite provider. Again, right after midnight, there's a quick, maybe a little test. I'm not sure what that was. They reverted back, and then finally put it on the purple, which is basically the direct line through the Equiano cable. So that was a good news story. Love to see these submarine cable activations. Not so good news story is the war in Ukraine, which is continuing to this day. I've been a part of the folks doing some documenting some of the impacts on the internet in Ukraine, and one of those was something I had come across earlier this year was this Russification of Ukrainian IPs. So we're talking about the Russian-held parts of Ukraine that are being subject to an assimilation campaign by Russia. Then they are forced to adopt everything from language, currency, telephone numbers, and of course internet service. And this utility that this Whois utility that RIPE publishes allows you to do historical lookbacks, and I'll demonstrate one of those in the next slide. And you can see that there is an effort to change the geolocation of all these IP addresses. So this example is a common one. There's dozens of these of a /21 or this 151.0.0.0/20 originated by Online Technologies in Donetsk, which is a part of the country that is presently held by Russia. On the 18th of July last year, the owners of this address space, don't know if they were coerced or they opted to do this, but nonetheless, we can see that the country was changed from Ukraine to Russia. And so the practical impact of this is that geolocation service providers, whether you use MaxMind or whoever, a lot of times mostly they just take geolocation data found in registration at face value. They do a little bit of special sauce to correct errors, but mostly they accept this. And so when you make a change like this, it'll get reflected in almost everyone's geolocation, every geolocation service provider's reports on where this address space is. And so, again, the practical impact would be users in these regions may encounter problems accessing any services that are blocked to Russian IPs now that these IPs have become Russian IPs in the eyes of the internet. It may require them to use a VPN or other means to sidestep geo-blocking, but this is part of a greater campaign to lay claim to these regions occupied by Russia to change the registrations to reflect the worldview that this is actually part of the country of Russia. Let's see. And I also did an analysis with the Wall Street Journal at the beginning of this year. So last year, you may recall that there was a rerouting of the internet in Kherson, which is a city in the south, just north of Crimea. I did a work with the New York Times last year to cover that, ended up being a front page story in maybe August last year. And then this year, the Wall Street Journal reached out and asked if there's another angle we could take to look at how things are changing within Ukraine. And so I decided I would reach out to KTIC, which is the internet measurement academic group at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. They have a ARC data set, which are servers around the world that are running trace routes to things all over the world. They happen to have a server that's been performing trace routes in Kiev for years, and I asked for the data for the past year, and so I got this. We could look at, so the scatter plot here is the measurements coming from that KTIC ARC server in Kiev, and so you can see during the first months of the year, marked with as Ukrainian transit, these are trace routes going from Kiev to providers in Kherson, and normally they're experiencing latencies below 20 milliseconds, maybe more like 15, 16 milliseconds, and then when the internet in Kherson gets rerouted through Crimea and on through Russia, those latencies jump up to be around 80 milliseconds. So that's greater than a round trip across the Atlantic Ocean, and we're talking about two cities that are separated directly by a highway. So the latencies jump up as traffic then is redirected through Europe and Moscow and back down through Crimea. It's a much longer path, and then, if you recall, last fall there was an offensive by the Ukrainian forces to retake some land. They retook the region of Kherson north of the Don River, and in the south is presently still held by the Russian forces. So how those ISPs connect depends on where they lie as far as that river goes. And so you can see that some of these providers drop back down in latency and return to using Ukrainian transit to reach the global internet, while others are still in regions held by the Russian forces and have to connect through Crimea and Russia to get to the outside world. This is an example of the trace routes. The one above is before the occupation. You have a direct route. The latencies are cut off, I think, on this, but it's about 15 milliseconds. And then on the one below, you can see the path has changed, where this is going from the same source to the same destination. Now it has to go out to Kiev, to WIN is Vienna, FFM is Frankfurt, then on to Stockholm, Moscow, and then down SMFL is Simferopol, which is a city in Crimea, and on to Kherson. So it's a much larger path to take to get to the destination. All right, so we've covered a lot of stuff here. In summary, let me go through these three different topics that we covered. So BGP, we made a lot of progress in BGP security. There's a lot of stuff left to be done, but I would argue that RPKI is doing its job to limit the disruption from origination leaks, and but we still need to continue expanding RPKI ROV. If your network hasn't done so, I would start with creating ROAs, then look into how you can reject RPKI invalid routes. The creation of ROAs ought to be a pretty easy thing. You just have to use the workflow in your local RIR. And then it would be nice if the routing security community can then pivot to focus our attention on this determined adversary scenarios, which we are seeing a lot of sophisticated attacks going after cryptocurrency services, and some involving BGP hijacks. Attackers, they're very smart at evading and getting around things like RPKI ROV or other types of routing security measurement mechanisms. We talked about the Azure outage and the Optus outage. These are caused by either a flawed router command and maybe a flawed router configuration. if you're, it's worth. I think a lot of people after the Optus explanation came out went and checked. If you haven't, you may want to check what's your, if you have max pref set on a Cisco router, what is the retry period? Is it forever? Because if it is, that's going to require manual intervention to get the system back on. It'd be better to put 300 seconds to ask for 5-minute standoff to retry establishing the session, and probably by then the leak has gone. That's a lesson learned there. And then submarine cables and geopolitics. Geopolitics continues to shape the physical internet. I wrote a piece arguing that I don't buy the rationale for the Department of Justice decision on the Aros Cable. They got a second cable anyway, but I would like to see our actions support our rhetoric as far as supporting free and open internet in places like Cuba or Iran that are under authoritarian regimes that need free communication. I wrote up a story of the 10 years of advocacy work. I didn't go through all the details in this presentation, but to connect this small island of St. Helena to its first submarine cable. And, excuse me, the internet in Ukraine continues to evolve over wartime conditions. Unfortunately, this conflict does not seem to be coming to an end anytime soon. So I expect we'll see more developments along these lines. Okay, so that concludes the presentation, and I would love to handle any questions that come up.
Thank you very much, Doug. This was a truly insightful and interesting presentation. So for our audience now, there is still time for you to submit your questions through the webinar console if you would like to do so. We already have a few questions come through, so I may just kick off with the first one, Doug. So I've got a question asking, how does the growth of Starlink potentially change the impact of internet shutdowns and other major outages?
So Starlink is on the tip of a lot of people's tongues these days. Elon Musk, the owner, is very famous. Starlink also is very famous. It is a pretty neat technology. This is a low Earth orbit constellation, so we have thousands of satellites just in very close to the Earth in their orbits. This enables them to have very low latency. There's a lot of innovation that goes on there, but on those two topics, especially on the internet shutdowns case, it is not. If you have an internet, if the government in a country has shut the internet off, it's not clear that Starlink can turn it back on, and so there's a few obstacles to doing so. The first is you'd have to get the ground terminals in, so the dish to somebody to reconnect. And depending on the country, that may be an illegal act. And so Alan Gross was a man who spent years in prison in Cuba for smuggling in satellite equipment to Cuba. That is an illegal act there. Iran is another case where you could be imprisoned or worse if you were found with this equipment. So that's not automatic. Obviously, the capacity of a satellite constellation is much less. The entire capacity of Starlink is orders of magnitude less than one submarine fiber optic cable. So you're not going to be able to recreate all of the capacity that would lost due to a government shutdown. But maybe you can connect some important people to the internet. But the other thing is that there are spectrum allocations governed by the ITU that have to be abide by. Depending on the country, you may have to have a license to operate. It changes country to country. So generally, these satellite operators, and Starlink isn't the only one, must get a legal authorization in order to operate there. Not doing so would be a violation of the law, although with Starlink, they actually did this last year, and they turned on service in Iran following the outages, the shutdowns. Iran took that to the ITU and just recently ruled in favor of Starlink, ruled in favor of Iran against Starlink, and we'll see how that plays out. But so Starlink is it's a really cool technology. Some of these cases, though, these shutdowns, I don't think it's going to going to help very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is really interesting. As you said, Starlink is on everyone's mind at the moment. So the next question is asking, what prevents greater adoption of RPKI ROV?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, there's two steps to make this work. You have to create ROAs, you have to reject invalids. So the creation of ROAs, I think for most entities, this is actually a pretty easy step of the two, where you, the resource owner, the entity that owns the IP address space, can go into their, whoever their RIR is, they can go to Aaron or Ripe, and within the there's a portal where they can set up, what is the expected origin and max prefix length that should be the internet should the RPKI should enforce. That part ought to be fairly easy. There are a few exceptions of entities that are legacy systems. If you have address space that is before the existence of the RIRs, then you have to figure out, come up with a deal for them to manage this for you. I think they're trying to make that an easy process. There's also the case of if you have address space that is leased or rented, then you may not be the actual resource holder, so you need to communicate with the entity that is the resource holder of setting what is the right ROA. But on the flip side, then rejecting invalids, this requires a little more work, where you're going to need some changes potentially to your infrastructure. Some routers won't reject invalids, so that may require the changing of equipment, and you may want a local validator where you can download all the routing information and locally validate. And so that's there's more work involved. So I think companies need to prioritize this, and it'll we'll continue making progress. Obviously, there's been a lot of companies that have looked at this and said this is doable, and have fielded it. So there's a lot of lessons learned out there. There's a lot of people who have made progress. So you're not the first one to do it. If you're encountering problems, get in touch with me or anyone else who's in this community. We can get you the right resources and get you the advice and help on how to get this going.
Great, thank you, Doug. So the next question is, what is the role of ICANN and RIPE in dealing with stolen or reclassified IP addresses in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine?
Yeah, this is a good question. I was just at a digital rights conference last week where there was a delegation from Ukraine going over what the state of internet telecom is in that country. There was a representative in the audience from ICANN, and the delegation kind of put him on the spot to kind of demand that they take action around stolen address space or reclassified address space. From the perspective of ICANN, which is a global body, they look to the local RIRs to create and enforce policy, and so he kind of kicked it over to RIPE, which I think makes some sense there. And RIPE has been trying to stay out of the politics of this and wants to stay neutral. The argument from the Ukrainian side is that this is stolen property, and we can't allow people to steal property and use it. They're also accepting government documentation from things like the Donetsk People's Republic, which is not a recognized entity. It's RIPE is in a difficult position to maintain its neutrality because it doesn't want to be shutting anybody off, but it's in a difficult position to it could go down a slippery slope where it has to then wade into a lot of issues. But this is one that is not likely to be resolved anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. And what are some other countries you think that would benefit from undersea cables being built?
Let's see. So Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I guess there's two areas of room for growth where we either want to have places where there are submarine cables but not enough, and we want to have more for resilience. Or there are places that still just don't have a submarine cable connection and rely on satellite. And so a lot of island nations, a lot of Pacific island nations have been really desperate for high-speed internet to keep up with a modern economy. And even if they want to have tourists come, the tourists want to use the internet, and without they're just on satellite. It's not. It doesn't create the experience that they want. Yeah, I think that the island nations, especially in the South Pacific, are the ones that make it are really tough, because you have to span a very long distance. It creates a very high amount of cost. And as I mentioned in a blog post I did last year about Tonga was an example of this, where they call it a thin route in the industry, where there's very little return on investment. In fact, you're probably not going to make any money off this connection, and it's a very costly, high-risk endeavor to build the submarine cable. So it's kind of a humanitarian effort to connect these islands. That's an area. Otherwise, I think there's enough demand in a lot of parts of the world that we'll see just the industry take care of the demand by building additional cables. There's quite a lot under construction right now.
Okay, thank you. And are you able to measure adoption of Aspa similar to RPKI?
That's a great question. I was asked by one of the Alexander Asimov is one of the creators of Aspa. He's an old friend of mine, and he had reached out with the same question. And I need to look into it because there's. I think what he was looking for was trying to measure the impact. There are some records that are created right now in RPKI for ASPA. How much is it doing is a good question, because not a lot of people are using it to reject routes. So that side of it might be negligible, the impact. But that ought to be something I work on next year, to try to get a hang, come up with some sort of methodology for measuring the adoption of ASPA. That's a good question.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have actually reached the end of our Q&A section now. And I would like to thank you, Doug, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to Kentik for making this possible. If I didn't get to any of your questions, rest assured they will be forwarded to our presenter, who may well reply by email. Big thank you to our audience for attending and participating through your questions. It would be great if you could join us for the next one as well.